sculpture. So sculpture is a three-dimensional medium in art. So let's see in detail. Give me 1 second. Selena has a technical issue. All right. So here is Michelangelo, and he is generally regarded as one of the finest sculptors in the Western tradition. Some would say greatest. Um, he is a Renaissance sculptor, architect, and painter, and he is a rival of Leonardo da Vinci. His name means Archangel Michael, and he began serious work as an artist at the age of 13 and did not stop until death claimed him 76 years later. So his equal may never be seen again. Sculpture's materials include diverse materials such as marble, metal, ceramics, wood, glass, wax, ice, plastic, and fiber. Sculptors' method today still include chiseling, as Michelangelo did, carving, molding, assembling, and constructing, but inventive sculptors are finding new ways to create their art and new materials to make it with. So there are two basic types for displaying sculptures. First style is freestanding sculpture, which is the three-dimensional approach, and the other style is relief sculpture, which is specifically designed for viewing from one side. So let's see in detail. So this is called like freestanding sculpture style. Although some freestanding sculpture is not intended, most freestanding sculptures display for showing every point of view, just like this sculpture. So everyone, look at this sculpture. Can you guess what's going on? What's happening here in this now sculpture?
Are they playing or wrestling?
Hmm, I love that. Wrestling. Yeah, looks like that.
It almost looks like a dance that they could be doing or something, or I don't know. I
Something
see
like this
ballet.
is
Top two
a dance
people.
or rescuing. Dance
Oh,
or rescuing.
rescuing. Oh, I love that. All right. So let me tell you the history related to this sculpture. So this is a powerful and beautiful sculpture by Jean Bologna, who is a Flemish artist working in Florence, Italy, designed the rape of a Sabine at the request of a Florence ruler, Francisco de Medici. The sculpture forms a kind of a spiral that draws the viewer around to view its made changing planes. Um, with each step, the viewer can discover unexpected details as the surface is a spiral upward. It recreates an ancient story about the foundation of Rome. Most of the early founders of Rome were male. For the city to grow, the Romans needed wives. They solved this problem by inviting their neighbors, the Sabines, to a festival during which Romans seized the Sabine women and forced them to marry. This story symbolized the ability of a small community to become the most powerful city in Italy, and which with this dramatic sculpture, Francisco um, announced to the Florentines and their enemies that, like Rome, Florence had risen to become a force to be reckoned with. Now let's move on to the next sculpture type, relief. There are two ways of relief in sculpture. One is bas relief and the other one is high relief. What's the difference between bas relief and the high relief, everyone?
One is darker.
Darker.
One is
And the
more
one is darker than the
detailed.
other.
The high relief looked more bolder than the
Yeah.
Yeah, it
bas.
look more
There we go.
detailed. Mhm.
Excuse
Yes,
me, sorry.
exactly. Very good. So, in bas relief means low in French. The sculptor's marks are shallow. An example of this kind of a sculpted surface was found in the North Palace of the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal in the ancient city of Nibia in Mesopotamia, where is current place in Iraq. In this high relief, the British sculptor Susan Durant chose to incise the surface more deeply for the figures closer to the viewer. That's the difference. Sculpture methods are either subtractive or additive. In the subtractive processes, a sculptor uses a tool to curve, drill, chisel, chip, whittle, or saw away unwanted material. In the additive processes of modeling, casting, or constructing, sculptors add material to make the final artwork. We are going to see few of these sculptural methods now. So this is the first one, carving. Everyone knows this sculpture, right?
Mount Rushmore.
Yeah. So the most ancient works of art that still exist were made using subtractive method of sculpture. One second.
I'm sorry, what did you say, Professor? I didn't hear you, the last part.
Oh, so this is using the subtractive method of sculpture. Now, so the most of these were made of stone and were worked by chipping, carving, sanding, and polishing. One of the largest and the most famous sculpture of portrait was executed using the subtractive method, carving on a mountainside in South Dakota. So the Mount Rushmore National Memorial was executed by John Borglum. And the Borglum approached the task with great care and drive, changing the original idea of local figures to that of 4 presidents. He spent 2 years looking for a mountain with the right stone characteristics to make the work a success. Most of the subtractive sculpting was done by skilled miners using dynamite, placed strategically to remove large masses of stone. The choice of location and drilling practice were essential because once the stone was removed, it could not be replaced.
Mm.
Mm.
Mhm.
And let's see the modeling as the additive method. Modeling in clay and wax is an additive process. The artist builds up the work by adding materials. Clay and wax are pliable enough for sculptors to model them with their hands. Larger sculptures, such as this ancient Copton sculpture, are built from multiple pieces fired individually. So we can see here assemblage line in the middle of the sculpture. So 4 separate baked sculpture pieces made up this coffin sculpture. And now let's see casting. Casting, which is another additive process, involves adding a liquid or pliable material to a mold. So it is done in order to set a form in a more durable material or to make it possible to create multiple copies of a work. So here is the detailed steps. The first step in casting is to make a model of the final sculpture. So number 3 is the final sculpture. This is used to make a mold. And a casting liquid is often molten metal, like this final sculpture, such as so the the original work for the casting is made like with the clay or plaster. Um, uh, oh, I'm sorry. The original one you used to make with the clay or wax, and the final sculpture is made with also clay or plaster or acrylic polymers or glass are used. Uh, so this is a mold, and it is poured into the other material is pouring in the mold, and when it hardened, the result is detailed replica of the original model. So let me share a video to see the complicated process of casting.
My name is Michael O'Keefe. I'm an artist working here in Dallas, Texas. I'll be making a
So
two-piece plaster.
he just created the original sculpture with the clay. Looks cool, right?
Are meant to divide the sculpture into two sections.
Yes.
In this case, I'll be making a two-piece plaster mold, dividing the sculpture into a front half and a back half. Next, we have to mix some plaster, and to make plaster, we add the gypsum powder to water. roughly at a ratio of 1 to 1, but the best way to mix plaster is to use your eyes and to add powder to water until it just barely sits on the surface of the water. And then you simply stir the lumps out of the plaster so it's a nice smooth consistency. At this point, we want to apply the face coat of plaster to the first half of the sculpture using a brush. We want to use a brush here to make sure that the plaster gets down into every little nook and cranny of the clay, and it wants to be a nice thin consistency so that any air bubbles can escape from the plaster. And then we want to take a spatula with a mixture of plaster that's further along in the process of setting up so that you can add it to the edge of the mold using your spatula. Then we want to add one more coat of plaster to the rest of the mold so that it's about 3 layers thick. The idea here is to have a relatively thin mold with a thicker section where the shims are. This gives the mold some strength and durability. At this point, you can remove the shims, sliding them out carefully so that you don't affect the original clay sculpture. You want to carve out some registration holes with a sharp tool, a knife or a chisel, so that the 2 halves of the mold will lock into place nicely when they're put back together. Here I'm painting on a clay slip to the shim line of the mold. This clay slip is just diluted clay or clay that's been mixed with water. Once the slip is applied, then we can mix up another batch of plaster and start to brush it on the sculpture, making sure we get plaster into all of the crevices of the sculpture and making sure that we put plaster on the shim edge. After the first face coat, we can then add another coat of thin plaster to the mold. Once both sides of the mold have 3 coats of plaster, then it's time to add some supports.
So let me just skip this part.
At first, you should chisel very lightly until the seam line fractures just slightly. At this point, I like to stick butter knives in the crack and wiggle them a little bit to loosen the 2 halves of the mold.
So he's gonna get rid of the clay, the original the clay work from the mold.
The mold we're making here is a waste mold, which means not only is the mold wasted after one cast, but also the sculpture is often wasted in the process of pulling apart this mold. You can see here that my sculpture is essentially tearing into 2 halves. But this is okay if we've made a good mold because the sculpture is captured in the mold in the negative. Once you've cleaned out as much of the clay as you can, you want to then soak the sculpture in water. Once you've soaked the mold, you want to then pour some Murphy's oil soap into the mold, and then using a large brush, you want to swirl the brush around, creating a froth that covers the whole surface of the mold. You want to soak each half of the mold 3 times, rinsing the mold in between each application of the soap. And this will assure that the plaster mold will fall off of the plaster cast very easily. At this point, we can rejoin the 2 halves of the mold and then secure them together using burlap dipped in plaster and then rolled up and tacked on.
All right, let me just skip this. Add.
Now we want to seal the seam all the way around with dollops of plaster to ensure that no plaster will leak out of the mold when we pour it in. Enough to fill the entire mold. At first, it's best to pour enough plaster to fill only
So he's recreating the sculpture with another material, the plaster.
about a third of the mold and then slosh it around to make sure that the plaster gets into all of the crevices of the mold. Then we can add more plaster, filling the mold almost all the way to the top. Shaking the mold is a way to make sure that air bubbles can escape from the plaster. Once you feel like you've got most of the air bubbles out, then you can tap it with a hammer, again trying to get out as many of the air bubbles that would be on the surface of the cast as possible. At this point, it's best to wait at least an hour to make sure that the poured plaster is sufficiently set inside the mold. Then we can begin to remove the supports, including the supports that hold the two halves of the mold together, trying to open that small seam again. Mold from the thick shim edge, but at a certain point you'll have to remove some of the thinner sections by chiseling away at that thin surface, and you pull out some small pieces of the mold that are stuck in crevices. The mold is made properly. In the end, one should have a perfect replica of the clay sculpture. The only difference, obviously, is that the final sculpture is in plaster rather than clay.
All right, so that was casting the additive sculpture process.
Very messy.
It is very complicated. All right, so we just saw the traditional sculpture styles. Now for so this traditional processes used for sculpting were ideal for the creation of a static object by artists. And in modern, there are diverse types of sculptures we can see, such as earthwork, construction, assemblage, ready-made, kinetic and light sculpture, and installation. So let's see each of the innovative sculpture styles in modern. So the first one is earthwork. Prehistoric artists of the Americas made monumental sculptures that used the surface of the earth itself as material. This was additive sculpture on a very large scale. The best known modern artwork is Robert Smithson's Spiral Jetty in the Great Salt Lake in Utah. Smithson chose a spiral shape naturally found in shells, crystals, and even galaxies. The coiled artworks was made by dumping 6,550 tons of rock and dirt off dump trucks, gradually paving a spiraling roadbed out into the Salt Lake.
That's crazy.
That's crazy. Can you see the people here?
Yeah.
Yeah, how
How
big it
mental-
is.
Yeah.
Oh,
He was
wow.
mentioned early on in the book under land artists.
Yeah,
There was a section at the beginning of the book talking about land art, and this design was mentioned there too.
yeah, that's right.
A
Yes.
lot of New York artists, I see a lot of it in New York as well.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So many of artists works with, earthwork. That is the type of a sculpture. Very good. And now let's see construction. The idea of constructing sculptures is relatively new. Method for doing so have proliferated with the growth of standardized engineered materials such as sheet metals and plastics. In the late 19th century, Sculptors begin to look beyond the traditional curved or cast forms to the process of constructing. This is British artist Damien Hirst's work, and he made his work the physical impossibility of death in the mind of someone living out of a large tank full of formaldehyde in which he suspended a dead shark. Of course, not every part of this work was constructed. Hearst had the shark caught by fishermen, and the entire work resembles a dissection specimen in a biology class. Hearst is known for creating his sculptures from unusual objects that contrast life and death. One second. Oh. Now let's move on to the assemblage. So the practice of gathering objects and fabricating them into a work of art is called assemblage. The gathered objects, sometimes called found objects, are repurposed so that they support the visual ideas and compositions of the artist. And now let's see, ready-made. So in the early 20th century, a few artists began to create works using raw materials. The raw materials are artifacts that already existed. Sometimes they simply decided that found objects were works of art. So this is the Pablo Picasso's work. So can you guess what the medium is? Can you guess, which part of the object?
Bicycle seat.
Yes, this is a bicycle seat, and this part is a bicycle's head, the handle. And then
Oh,
he created what? Bull's head.
The bull's head. Yeah.
Yeah, it looks like a bull's head. So creative, right?
yeah.
Yeah. So such artworks are known as ready-made. And also we learned this ready-made on the very first day of the course when we saw the Marshall Disham's fountain, the male's urinal. That
Mhm.
also, yeah, ready-made. Now let's move on to the kinetic and the light sculpture. Can you remember what the kinetic means? Movement. Any, any art type of movement called like kinetic. So the technical advances in our society have created more opportunities for creativity. And sculptors who work with movement and light express their ideas in ways that would not have been possible just a century or two before. These moving and lighted sculptural works, similar to those of the constructivists, rely on mechanical engineering as well as the creative input of the artist. And sculptures that moves is called kinetic sculpture. And the last one of the innovative sculpture style, modern, is installation. Modern artists have explored many ways of expanding the range of sculpture as a medium. Installation sculpture involves the construction of a space or the assembly of objects to create an environment. And we are encouraged to experience the work physically using all our sense, perhaps entering the work itself. So these are all new types of sculpture method. So now we recognize, there are lots of sculptures in diverse ways around us. So I hope you understand the flow of the sculpture in art through this chapter. And we have a discussion topic related to this chapter. So everyone, after this meeting, please go to the Moodle room and go to week 7. And please find the week 7-1 discussion. And here is the topic. So what is the difference between sculpture and an installation? So as the viewer, which one do you prefer and why? Please state the reason why you prefer which types of sculpture. I mean, the sculpture or installation. So that's the topic. And again, please check your grade and then let me know if you have any question. Please send me an email. And also next Thursday, when is the day? So next Thursday is March 3rd. I'm sorry, next Wednesday, March 2nd, is the midterm day, and we're gonna review all the chapters in the next meeting by on the coming Monday. So please do not miss the next meeting. That is really important for your midterm.